So we're doing the classic shirt construction now. I'm working with a half scale Dartless Block here, but the measurements that I'm going to give, I'll actually give you full scale measurements, because I know it probably gets very confusing when I say 5 centimeters, half scale, that means 10 centimeters full scale. So we'll just go with the full scale measurements, and then you can apply those to your full scale pattern when you use the full scale Dartless Block. So this is our Dartless Block. So we have a front here, center front. That would be on the fold, or that's where you add your extensions for front openings. Our collar here, shoulder, armhole with a single balance notch there in the front. Side seam, straight side seam with a waist notch there, and the other pieces, so the back. So the back neck, shoulder, armhole down the side seam here. The double back notches for the back armhole and single side seam notch there to match up with the front. And then our sleeve block here. So sleeve block with one front notch, a shoulder notch, and 2 back notches. So those notches there, match up when you're sewing the sleeve in there and there. So even though these are different shapes, they still sew together, and they're not too hard to do either because they're curves. Okay, so starting with the front, we want to outline the block, and you don't always do this when you're pattern making. You don't always outline the whole block to begin with, because sometimes you have to move things, and having too many lines can get a bit confusing. So make sure when you outline it too, you include the armhole notch and the waist notch there. And the first thing we're going to do, now that we've outlined it, is we're going to add some shape to the front hem. So that's on the dummy here. You can see our block goes straight across, and we're going to add in this length here. So we're going to drop it down 5 centimeters. So measure down our 5 centimeters, and then what we want to do here is we want to get a nice smooth line. So when you're drawing a curve, it's always easier to draw the curve, like away from your hand, rather than trying to do it, like the other way, this way here. So give yourself a little bit of flatness when it touches the side seam, and then curve that around. So that's probably the curve, stops about halfway across the front hem as a reference point there. Okay, so we've got our front hem shape. Now we need to start adding on an extension down the front. The extension. So the extension, when you look at the sample, the buttons actually are on the center front, and the extension is the fabric that goes from that center front out to the folded edge here. And it's that 1.5 centimeter extension that we're adding. And so 1.5 on this side of the garment, 1.5 on this side of the garment, which makes the crossover there. So the two combined mean that you have a 3 centimeter crossover. So a 1.5 centimeter extension on each side means that you have a 3 centimeter crossover. And that's pretty standard for all shirts and blouses and kids wear, and even, like I use it mostly for jackets as well, unless you've got a particularly big button, so you might want a bigger extension. But it's really just a good general number to have in your head for your extension. So we're adding on 1.5 down the front here. All the way down the center front there, and we can just extend, so that center front extends out to meet there and extends at the bottom. Actually, you can take it a bit further along at the bottom. So that's our extension of 1.5. And so now that we've got an extension, we need some fabric. So we've gone from the center front out to the fold. Now we need some fabric to go from that fold back underneath. And that amount is usually twice the extension. So that's going to be 3 centimeters that we need to add. Okay. So this is your facing, yeah. So what we've done, we've come from the center front here, where the buttons are. We've added 1.5. Now we've just added the 3 centimeters that goes from the fold back underneath here. And the last thing we need to do, because you can't just have that as a raw edge or overlocked, because that'd be really ugly. So we want that edge turned under. So we need to add an extra 1 centimeter to fold underneath here. So we add another 1 centimeter to tuck under there. Okay, so and then at the top here, this is our center front, and that would be mirrored by a center front here, because this is the fold line, so this would turn under. So if we put a little mark there, because this is going to fold back underneath, so we can actually use our block to create that fold back there. So that lines up with that. And so this is as your fold line. This is your fold line here. So when you fold back, this fabric will end up back under here. And that's why you've got a little bit of shape coming up here, because it's, that fold line is like a mirror line. So whatever shape you have on this side, you have on the other side as well. Okay. And we might talk about buttons later, but generally on a shirt, you have the top button, which is on the actual collar, and you have a button, the first button is up a little bit higher. On a lot of women's garments, you'll find, and it's always a good thing to keep in mind, but it doesn't always work design-wise, to try and have a button between the bust prominence. So, if the shirt's a little bit tight on somebody and it pulls, you don't want it to, to gape open like this. So if you have the button on that, where there's the most tension across the bust there, that'll help stop that from gaping. But of course, it depends on your style that you're doing, and sometimes it just doesn't work to have a button in that position. But it's something to keep in mind. So fold, and you could also write center front on this line here as well. So just a little CF and then a fold there. So what have we got now? So with this pattern, we're nearly finished our front pattern now. We're going to bring this shoulder line here, literally sits right on the top of the shoulder. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring that shoulder line forward, and you can see here when you look. So if the shoulder seam was actually on the shoulder, you wouldn't be able to see it. So it's just one of those menswear things where you bring the yoke forward, and it just gives a nice definite line across the shoulders. And I suppose part of the reason you do it is so that the shoulders look broader as well, because you're adding these horizontal lines across the shoulder. But yeah, sometimes if you leave the shoulder seam in its original place, it actually looks like it's falling backwards on the shoulder. So bringing this forward counteracts that as well. So we're just going to bring our shoulder forward 2 centimeters. And remember, the measurements that are on here too are on the PowerPoint. So this is the PowerPoint that you can follow. So this is on Blackboard. And you'll be able to, it'll have all of the measurements on there. So I haven't written measurements on here, but you'll be able to use that as a reference. So, and I'm just going to cross out the original line so that we now know that this is our new shoulder line here. Okay, so to finish off this front piece, we need to add seam allowances. So we already have our front extension facing and a 1 centimetre seam allowance along this edge. It's just what, when you're constructing the front, generally you finish that completely. But now we want to add seam allowances around the rest of the pattern. So at the bottom, we'll add 1.2 centimetre seam allowance. And try and, when you're adding the seam allowances, try and use your grading ruler. And so if you put, half scale, this is 6 millimeters for my 1.2. So I've actually found that 6 millimeter line there from the edge, and I sit that line on top of the stitch line, which is the original construction line that we've done. And then I keep looking, so I don't look at this edge here, I just follow the pencil along there. And as you come up, I'm not sure how easy this is to see, Libby, but as you come up to a curve, you move the ruler around so that it matches up with the next point. So you're always keeping this line on top of this line underneath, and then using it to add the extension.
Yeah, it makes it really quick and a less rough line, I guess, too.
Yeah, exactly. And literally, it's really just practice to get you into the swing of it. So I've moved my waist notch onto the edge of the cut edge, so I've added 1 centimetre seam allowance there. Need to add 1 centimetre around the armhole. And transfer the armhole notch onto the cut edge there. 1 centimetre onto the shoulder, and then it's only 6 millimetres around the neck.
Is there anywhere where you have a really tight curve like that, 6 millimetres is pretty much an industry standard for a seam allowance somewhere like that?
Yeah, because it's just really annoying to sew a neckline with 1 centimetre seam allowance. Almost impossible. Commercial patterns have 1.5, and I'd say it would be impossible to neatly sew a collar onto a neckline using a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance.
And then you have to cut it back anyway, and that takes time.
Yeah, well, that's what they say in commercial patterns. They tell you to sew it at 1.5, and after you've sewn it, they tell you then to cut it back to 6 millimetres. So, if you start with 6 millimetres, it helps in the first place. Exactly. Now, I just need the only notch that I need along my front neckline here is the notch to indicate the fold. And remember too, a little notch, so if you've only got a 6 millimetre seam allowance, remember that your notches can only be 2 or 3 millimetres long. You can't have a 6 millimetre seam allowance and then do like a 7 or 8 millimetre notch, because it means you'll actually see, once the collar's stitched on, you'll still see a hole in the fabric here. So no need to notch the centre front, because there's no centre front notch on the collar, as we'll come to see. So just that fold line. You could also mark it down the bottom as well.
That makes it easy when you go to the iron.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So you fold along there, and then down the length, you can use then your tape measure to make sure it stays consistent.
Yeah, so notches really do make sewing a lot easier and quicker, and more accurate. Gives you something to follow without having to constantly be checking back to the pattern all the time.